It's the same thing with students from lower income backgrounds, that you look around and you don't see yourself there. You don't see yourself, in these paintings on the wall, or even in some of the stained glass that they have all over campus depicting different images, or, you didn't learn about the history of New England and its importance for the country and all this, and things that you're kind of expected to know. And for me, I said this at a talk the other day. It's like, it sounds kind of stupid, but I didn't even know, like when I would sit down to have dinner in these nice restaurants, to put a napkin on my lap.
Hello, my name is Emmy DeGrappa. Each week, we bring you stories asking our guests the question why. We learn about passion, purpose, and the human experience. Brought to you by Wyoming Humanities with the generous support of the Wyoming Community Foundation. This is What's Your Why? Today, we are talking to Justin Farrell. Justin is a sociology professor and author at Yale University. His research explores questions of environment, politics, human culture, and policy. He just released a book titled Billionaire Wilderness, The Ultra-Wealthy and the Remaking of the American West. Welcome, Justin.
Thank you. Great to be here.
Well, I'm so excited that the first thing I read in your bio on your homepage of your website is that you are a proud first-generation college student from Wyoming.
I am, yeah. I was born in Cheyenne. It's where my dad was born, and my parents went to high school, and both of my brothers were born there. And so I have what I view as a pretty deep connection to the state in lots of different ways, not just being born there, but especially in the last 15 years or so, in terms of devoting all my waking hours thinking about what's going on in the state and what's going on regionally in areas around Wyoming, and have devoted most of my career thus far and into the future. I'm studying, the environmental dynamics, the social dynamics, political dynamics, and just trying to understand that area in more depth, and I think in all its complexity as well.
Well, what do you find most intriguing about growing up in Wyoming?
Well, for me, what was interesting is that my dad was transferred, and so my brother and I went to school mostly in Nebraska, and so we were the only ones in our family on my dad's side to have left, for the most part, Cheyenne. My mom's side, she is from Idaho, and so we would always kind of travel from Nebraska back. My dad started working at Union Pacific Railroad in Cheyenne, I think toward the end of high school, if that's right, but somewhere around there, and then was transferred to the headquarters in Nebraska. And so it's been really interesting in the sense of I left, but then we would come back all the time for just family gatherings. And then when I went to college, I had applied just to one school. Neither of my parents went to college, and so when I was thinking about, I suppose I should go. Some of my friends are going, and I applied to one school, which was Oklahoma Baptist University, because a friend of mine was like, you should go there. It's pretty affordable. So I went to college then in Oklahoma, and had always just I thought about Wyoming a lot. I thought about the West just in general, especially the interior West. So it's not just about Wyoming in the sense of what's been motivating me all these years. And so I went to school down in Oklahoma, and then took a couple trips out west with my friends, and just kind of reconnected in that way as well, in addition to talking with family. And so it's been this kind of patchwork connection that I've maintained, and it wasn't really strengthened in an intense way relative to my work until I got to graduate school. And so I went to this small college down in Oklahoma, and then from there applied to graduate school, and that was on the East Coast in Princeton. And from there, that's when I really started kind of thinking about making a career of studying the West and studying Wyoming in particular. And it was, for me, I think, this subconscious way to reconnect to my family, but also just reconnect to all the childhood experiences I had in the state, both, in the southeast part of the state, and in areas like Teton County and Yellowstone. And so it's this I think, attempt by me to merge my personal and kind of family connections with my professional life.
Well, who inspired you to actually pursue your college education? Because it says that you're a first-generation college student and neither of your parents went to college. So did they encourage you? Did they think that was important? How was it that was your journey to not only just get a bachelor's, but go on to get a doctorate?
Yeah, my parents were always very supportive of whatever I did, even if they weren't really aware about what I was doing. And I think they, of course, knew about college, but the pressure I received was probably mostly from my friends who, you look around when you're in high school and everybody's going. And so I thought I should apply. And, I went to a school that I knew I could afford on my own. And I'm almost done paying off my loans. Thank God. They were always very supportive. And I think they sort of knew that was a good thing to do. But, not having done it, it's kind of a foreign thing. And it's, how do you go about even applying? Where should you look? What makes a good school? What makes a school that's not so great? And so for me, I just was on the internet myself and was looking around and tried to find a school that was affordable. And I also was eager to get out of that bubble that I was in Nebraska. And looking back, though, I wish I would have went to a school that was, maybe in Colorado or Wyoming. But, that's kind of how it played out. And I went down to Oklahoma. But I got, it was a good choice. And I think, it was affordable college for me at the time. And I'm really glad I did it. And I think it's really instilled in me an appreciation in my own work now as a professor, about students from backgrounds where college might be somewhat of a foreign concept, or, you don't have the sort of cultural capital or human capital to make connections to know where to apply, or what you should even do when you get there. And so I've always been kind of a lone wolf in a lot of what I do. And that was certainly no exception in terms of just, going to college. And I remember I was filling out my college application when I was out in Idaho. We were visiting my mom's family out there. And I remember filling that out and writing the little essays and all of that. And actually, it was kind of a tough time because my older brother had just passed away in a car accident. And we were just kind of like, yeah. So we were out. We went out west from Nebraska to see our family and try to recover a little bit. And so I always remember just sitting there, at my grandpa's table, filling that out and explaining to my extended family and my parents kind of what I was thinking and why I wanted to go to college. And again, they were very supportive, but not in the same way as maybe, Yale's undergraduate students and the support that they typically receive in terms of, being groomed for higher education. But I'm very appreciative of my upbringing because I think I have a chip on my shoulder and I don't take really any of it for granted. And when it comes to the work I'm doing, I think it gives me a unique lens to see the social world and to maybe understand folks from different social classes and backgrounds and from rural areas, and to write about it with empathy and maybe accuracy that other folks who maybe grew up in more blue, quote unquote, blue blood atmospheres on the East Coast, that they wouldn't typically have that perspective. So I've tried to harness it for good.
You know what? I just caught onto something that you were saying, and I think it's really interesting. And you said, I have a chip on my shoulder, and it's good. And, usually when someone says, oh, that guy has a chip on his shoulder, they think that that's a negative thing, but you've actually embraced it.
I have. And I think at times it can turn to be a little bit more negative, or I can perhaps, not see the best in people who come from more privileged educational backgrounds. And I think that, I'm careful to to see people for their experiences and to understand where they're coming from. But I certainly, am attracted to, for example, like if I'm looking for students doing interesting work, or if I'm looking at someone's resume to kind of see the trajectory of where they've come from. And I'm often really impressed by that because I know the barriers that folks can face who come from certain backgrounds, and whether it's, an underserved urban area or whether it's an underserved rural area, or, to me, seeing those experiences and seeing people's stories are fascinating. And I think is kind of part of this chip on my shoulder. And I'm always looking for folks who have that experience. But I also think it improves people's work, and it can tie them to communities that they're studying. And for me, it's, oftentimes rural communities. And in the case of the new book, it understanding wealth and the ultra wealthy, but doing so through maybe more empathy than other folks might be able to muster, because I can kind of see how these experiences lead you to be the way you are and to believe what you believe and act how you act. And so that's kind of how I try to harness that for better. But it does at times make me sort of, especially in the past when you're applying to PhD programs and you're trying to match up with people who might have a Yale undergraduate degree and you're applying against them. And I'm coming from, a small Baptist college in Oklahoma, that you can become a little bitter, But for me, I tried to let my work do the talking and to, do really good research that people find to be interesting.
I'm really glad you have that empathy for students who are maybe first generation entering into college, or just kind of facing the same challenges you faced, where, you're filling out student loan applications or, a college application, and it's such foreign territory that it's a scary thing. And there's no one that you can, you're not generations down the road. And of course, my son's going to go to blah, blah, blah. You're really just treading new territory for you and your family.
Yeah, I agree. And in the past few years, I've really focused on not just trying to attract students from those backgrounds and from Wyoming, frankly, to Yale. But I found that it's as important that after students get to campus, that the type of mentorship that I provide and that they need, is really important to make them feel comfortable, to make them feel like they belong, to make them feel like their ideas and experiences are valid and can contribute, to ongoing work at a university like Yale, which, to be honest, I'm still very uncomfortable with in many days. And I feel like many of my students, this sense of what we call imposter syndrome, where you feel like you maybe shouldn't be there, or it was a fluke that you got in, or for me, it would be like a fluke that I got that job. But all that just kind of can be really hard for students. And so lately I've been focusing on really trying to provide close mentorship and to, address those concerns head on, and to say that it's okay that you don't feel comfortable here. It's okay that you felt uncomfortable even applying. But so many of those students that I've worked with are my best students, and they're doing really interesting work that, frankly, some of it's not being done at places like Yale because those universities have become so disconnected from some parts of the country and from some perspectives that need to be heard, even if certain people disagree with them or not, So that's kind of where I've put my energy in terms of mentorship and what I'm looking for in students.
That is so interesting and so important, because especially going to an Ivy League school and coming from a small school, a small Baptist school, but not really understanding that a first-time kid entering into college who doesn't have, his family doesn't have a legacy of college graduates, that the staying power is really hard.
Yeah, and there's research on that in terms of students from that type of background, or especially students of color who might come to Yale, and you look around, and it's the same thing with students from lower income backgrounds, that you look around and you don't see yourself there. You don't see yourself, in these paintings on the wall, or even in some of the stained glass that they have all over campus depicting different images or You didn't learn about the history of New England and its importance for the country and all this, and things that you're kind of expected to know. And for me, I said this at a talk the other day. It's like, this sounds kind of stupid, but I didn't even know, like when I would sit down to have dinner in these nice restaurants, to put a napkin on my lap. Like we just, something so simple, or to hold your knife in your opposite hand while you eat. These kind of cultural signifiers and cultural capital that people just take for granted, and that can make you feel so uncomfortable or out of place, and maybe at worst unwelcome if you don't know those sorts of things. And that might be a silly example, but I think it does sort of reveal what it can be like to enter an Ivy League environment where there have been people, multi-generational, families who attend, and their grandparents attend, or even beyond that, or their mother or father is, working for the Obama administration, or something, just all these different experiences and the exposure to this entirely different world. And for me, that didn't happen until I was out of undergraduate, and when I went to graduate school, that I recognized that, this is different. And my wife and I moved up to New Jersey, and I did my master's in sociology of religion at Princeton. And, just to kind of experience that world in Princeton was really eye-opening.
What was your spiritual or your religious upbringing?
Yeah, so my dad's side, the Cheyenne family, is Catholic. My mom's side has a Mormon background. They're from Idaho, but then kind of mixed with Protestantism. So when we were raised Protestant, and in like middle school or so, we attended, you would probably call it a mega church. It wasn't really huge, but kind of a run-of-the-mill evangelical. And then when I got to college, I've studied religion since I was in college, and I was a philosophy undergrad. And I've always been interested in religion, and from a personal and professional perspective. But when I got to college, I just kind of stopped going to church, and we'll see here. And then I went to graduate school to study sociology of religion. And this was also in a seminary setting. So I had friends who were training to become ministers, and these were Presbyterian ministers. So many of them, it was my first exposure to more like progressive religion, if you want to put it that way, or religion that was more focused on, some would say, more biblical values, like, caring for the poor, and the red letter Christians, you might, call them, focused on poverty reduction, homelessness, and caring for the environment. And that opened my eyes back up to the sort of value, or seeing religion in a way that I felt was like less destructive to kind of my journey. But the interesting thing is, my wife and I started attending this parish. I went to graduate school at Notre Dame, and I kind of reconnected then with my dad's side of the family with Catholicism, and my wife and I have been attending ever since. And I wouldn't say we go every week, but it's, it definitely plays a role in our life and provides meaning. And for me, it provides a moral imperative, to try to be a better person, and even if with my research, choosing topics that I think are going to make a positive impact on the world, and aren't just research for research's sake, or to further my own career.
Well, I have to say that what you just told me, now I'm smiling, because you went from a small Baptist university to Notre Dame and then to Yale. So that's quite a journey, Justin. It's like... Yeah,
I know. And it's pretty wild. And I went to, so in between there, I did the 3-year master's degree. So just to kind of lay out the timeline, I went, so it was Oklahoma Baptist University. And from there, was just enthralled with my studies and philosophy. And there was an English course that I took that we read some of the American canon that just kind of blew me away in terms of being exposed to all these different ideas. And I knew that at that time, I wanted to do this for a living. I wanted to teach. I wanted to explore philosophical ideas, but I always had kind of an eye toward how it impacts the real world. So not just, philosophy in a vacuum. And so then I did apply to go to graduate school to study sociology of religion at Princeton, and in this setting where it was a mix of philosophers, sociologists, ministers. And then from there, applied to PhD programs and really chose a field where I wanted to study, and that was sociology. And then and that's where I went to Notre Dame and that was a 5-year program. So it's 3 years in Princeton and 5 years at Notre Dame, and then from there straight to Yale. So I haven't been in outside of academia ever in terms of like professionally.
Oh my
once
gosh.
I started, after kindergarten, I have not been outside of school.
That's really interesting because and funny because it's like, okay, you're a professional student. That's amazing. Yeah. That's amazing.
I am. Yeah. It's odd and my parents, I think, and even all of my friends, they're just like, how are you in academics? Because my personality and sort of if you hung out with me on the weekend or if we had a barbecue or something during the week, you wouldn't peg me as a professor in terms of the stereotypical image people usually have. But I kind of, going back to that chip on my shoulder, that's been my identity throughout all of this, that I'm really focused on my work and I work really hard at it. But I also really try to keep a foot in the real world, so to speak, and not, in terms of, my friends, in terms of, I love, this sounds kind of crazy to even say, but, I really love sports, love all kind of music. It's not the typical image you have of an Ivy League professor in like a tweed jacket listening to Mozart.
Smoking a cigar.
Yeah, exactly.
So Justin, I want to ask you, because I really have become really interested in your book, Billionaire Wilderness. And I want to know, what was your idea? What came into your brain that said, I'm going to write this book and this is what it's going to be about and this is why I'm going to write it?
Yeah. So it stems from my time in Wyoming doing research, but also just growing up, going out to Western Wyoming every year for the summer. And during the summer, we would go out for several weeks. And I think seeing that whole area change so much, and we would spend time over in Victor and then even further in Island Park is where my grandfather in Idaho, just on the border of Yellowstone, he had a little condo there since, I think like early 70s maybe. And so I was out there since I was, a little kid, and just kind of seeing it slowly change, I think it started to pile up, like not in a negative way. I just would see, across the street, they would, there was a small hotel built, and it had a little hot tub and a little pool, and families would come. But then a golf course was built. And then, you would go into West Yellowstone, or we would drive through Jackson, and just every time we'd come, it'd look a little different. And seeing kind of how it was growing and changing, and not just more people, but it just looked a little different. I would hear, snarky comments from my family about, Jackson Hole, that used to be part of Wyoming, now it's not, or, we never really spent much time there. And I write about that in one of the chapters, is that it was kind of viewed as Jackson Hole was like across the train tracks, so to speak. And not just it was kind of from both sides. It was like the Cheyenne family would think that, but also my mom's Idaho family. And so just hearing all these things, as I was being raised and as we were spending time in that area, planted a seed that I didn't even realize was going to grow into this, massive tree and take up 6 years of my life. But it really started in graduate school when I was planning out what I was going to do for my dissertation, which is kind of the main project that you do to earn your PhD. And it's a multi-year project. It's basically like writing a book. And so that became a book that I published in 2015 called The Battle for Yellowstone. And in this book were the seeds again for what became Billionaire Wilderness. So I was really interested in human culture, and I know this podcast is about the why questions, and those are the types of questions that have animated my entire research program and why humans behave the way that they do or that we do. And so I think that these questions should be more central within social science research, and the types of cultures that we are a part, the subcultures, and why we live our lives the way we do, and what we strive for, and what narratives we live by. Whether that could be nature is a pure kind of storehouse that we need to protect versus nature is something that we can plunder for our own gain. Those are pretty extreme narratives, but they're narratives that shape how things play out in certain areas. And then how we determine right or wrong, and what we should do, and then really why it all matters in the end. Why are we even doing anything?
Right.
What kind of life do we want to lead? This sort of philosophical questions that, back to Socrates, was asking about what does a good life look like? What does a good community look like? And these questions, for me, are seen in really sharp relief in Western Wyoming, especially, where you have this mix of massive intact ecosystems that are really pristine ecologically. You have all sorts of people coming in. You have locals who have lived there for many generations. You have a strong federal presence in terms of the federal government and land management agencies. And so it's this really interesting mix to probe these why questions that I've always been interested in looking at, and doing so in a way that's going to matter for policy, and that is going to allow me to say, okay, I'm not just asking these questions for fun, and I'm not just writing about, why people may view the wolf as this sacred or spiritual being that needs to be restored, or why people hate the wolf in a way that is almost bordering on, a religious disdain for this animal that, is just doing what it does. But I can take those issues and try to understand them in their depth and link them to different cultural narratives in the West, in Wyoming, but then apply them to policy. And so the first book that I did using this framework was to look at environmental conflicts about Yellowstone. So you have, the wolf issue, obviously. You have this bison issue. I actually lived for a short time with this group that studies and protects, that they aim to protect the bison because they're viewed as sacred by this group. And then I looked at, the snowmobiling issue, just to show that morality and the why questions, and even sometimes spirituality, are all part of this, even though it's suppressed by the scientific frameworks that are imposed on these issues. But ultimately, why we care about them in the first place are not because of the science. We use the science to try to understand and to improve our relationship. But those relationships, again, are based on these moral questions about, who we want to be as humans, and how we want our communities to operate, and what's our relationship to the natural world, and all of that. So then after I finished that book, I was, convinced that the issue of wealth has not been looked at very closely. There are reports out, local reports about, the growth of wealth in Teton County or in larger cities in the West, even, Denver, Seattle, San Francisco. But what I thought was missing was this closer look at wealth, and what better place to do it than the richest county in the richest country in the world, Teton County.
Right.
And I have so many connections there already from the first book that it was really a no-brainer. And so it was motivated by some of these personal experiences I've had about wealth and how the area was just kind of changing a little bit. But then there was this other side, this almost like societal or academic need for a study of ultra wealth and wealth concentration in the United States. And I just used Teton County as my case study. And so the book is about Teton County, but in a lot of ways, it's about where our country has been heading for the last few decades in terms of growing wealth concentration and how the middle class is kind of being squeezed out and pushed down to the other end of the income spectrum. And so that it was just like this perfect case study for me to engage those economic questions, but also engage wealthy people on these questions about why they live their life the way they do. And, do they feel bad about having that much money? Do they have trouble sleeping at night like some people think? And how do they use nature and this rural setting to kind of solve some of those problems or to engage with those problems? So it was just this fascinating book that came together almost on accident, but really rooted in a lot of my personal experiences in the West and in Wyoming.
Well, it doesn't sound like it was an accident to me. It sounds like it was like the path you were on, and I can see how that would be a very obvious place for you to go from your Yellowstone book, especially when you start looking at the disappearance of the middle class. And why is that, and what's happening there? And I agree with you. Teton County just kind of screams it out in a way that is interesting to think, how can I approach somebody and ask them a meaningful question about why they live here? Or what is Jackson Hole?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, I agree. And the other thing is that these issues about wealth inequality, they receive a lot of attention, but it's usually, again, just in Wall Street or Silicon Valley, and that there's this huge hole relative to what we know about how wealth works. And places like Teton County are overlooked, and they just, they're kind of seen as these rural backwaters or this, maybe an oddity, like, oh, that's kind of cute. But real income inequality is like, on Wall Street or again in Silicon Valley and San Francisco. But I argue that that's short-sighted and misses the point and overlooks something that I think is deeply important, especially relative to how it intersects with environmental issues. So I guess you're right, though. It was this path I was on. It was almost like inevitable. I engaged this issue. But to spend 6 years of my life on it, I don't know. I'm glad I did. I really am. But I'm kind of like, wow, I can't believe I spent that much time just trying to understand this dynamic.
I think it's an amazing dynamic that first of all, it's amazing that you took it on. The amazing dynamic is that you turned over a rock. You turned over like something that's hidden, and then you just exposed it. And that's why you're probably receiving a lot of different opinions about your book, and depending on who's reading it and where they, what their economic status is, where they fit in that picture, and how they feel about that, how they feel about themselves, how they feel about wealth in general, and does it bother them? Does it, just is this disgusting?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And that's a question in the book that I try to leave up to the reader, and I really try to paint a picture that captured the reality of wealth there, and just the extent to which wealth has transformed some of these areas in the West and will continue to do so, but isn't, on the other hand, just a sloppy attack on the rich, because that to me was not at all interesting. And it's not what I do as an academic in terms of trying to spend many years embedding myself within a community, doing interviews, studying the quantitative data, what's been happening, what do we know relative to, per capita income or median income, or how many assets does this organization have? And what does that tell us about why this organization has next to nothing? And so making all these different comparisons and trying to situate it within what I felt was a context that would paint, an accurate picture of what was going on. Now, the issues themselves are contentious, so that I think anytime you raise them, it's going to spark all sorts of emotions. People are going to get defensive. Some people are going to, write it off. Others are going to take it too far. And I've received all sorts of different emails from people, but I rest in the fact that I really tried to be accurate and fair. And fair by what I mean by that is reporting what I saw and reporting what we know from the quantitative data, not being fair just to be fair to folks, but really pointing out, and when I need to be critical, being critical, and assessing the situation from the perspective that I gained through these 5-6 years. And so what I hope, and kind of what you alluded to, is that it's going to start a conversation that I think needs to be had, even though it is deeply uncomfortable for some people. And to be honest with you, the research made me uncomfortable with my relation to some of these communities, my relationship to nature, the wealth that I have compared to people, not just in this country, but outside of the United States. And, is wealth just kind of relative? People, who don't even have clean water compared to me, the differences between us, is very great, and perhaps greater than the distance between myself and one of my interviewees in Teton County. It's just a fascinating topic that raises all sorts of eyebrows, but I think raises many more really interesting questions that we need to discuss in the West in particular, and the Intermountain West, where some of these communities are growing and changing very quickly, and a lot of it has to do with wealth and then the problems that come with it.
I don't think this is the end. I think this is the beginning. I think this conversation between wealth and status and American exceptionalism, all these topics are ongoing because history is alive. And we're always making history. Yesterday was history. And so I think this conversation just goes on and on and on, because as people, we're always changing. And the conversation just changes with us.
Mm-hmm. I agree. And what's funny is that when I set out to do this project, Billionaire Wilderness, I told people that I wanted to interview. I said, I'm writing a recent history of this area. I want to know how it's growing, how it's changing, but my aim is to write a recent history. And that's true. It doesn't, divulge all the topics that I'm interested in getting at, but wealth is the recent history in this particular area. And that's not to say it's all bad, but it's to say we need to really think harder about it and have the tough conversations so we can kind of figure out where we want to go, which has to do with, again, the why questions and the how. Right.
Well, it's been great talking to you, Justin. And I am just so grateful that we had this time to talk. It's really interesting.
Yeah, no, it's a pleasure to be on. And I'm sure, it's the first of many conversations. I'll be doing work here for the rest of my career. So I'm sure our paths will cross again.
Thank you for joining us for this episode of What's Your Why? Brought to you by Wyoming Humanities with support from Wyoming Community Foundation and generous supporters like you. To learn more, go to thinkwhy.org, subscribe, and never miss a show.